social model of disability represents a great change in the way of thinking about the subject of disability. Since its inception, countless journal articles, presentations, books, and book chapters have been devoted to its powerful critiques of reflexive assumptions having to do with normativity, hierarchy, and the nature and function of social institutions that create barriers to the full inclusion of disabled people in society. It is incumbent, then, on the music therapy community to engage the social model of disability, since many of the clientele of music therapists are disabled people. What is the social model of disability? Thomas succinctly defined the social model, quote, "In short, the social model asserts that disability is not caused by impairment, but by the social barriers, structural and attitudinal, that people with impairments, physical, intellectual, and sensory, come up against in every arena. The social model views disabled people as socially oppressed, and it follows that improvements in their lives necessitates the sweeping away of disablest social barriers and the development of social policies and practices that facilitate full social inclusion and citizenship. The social model of disability deconstructs some false dichotomies. On the subject of false dichotomies, Rolfsjord elaborated by pointing out that other binaries coexist with the disabled normal construction. She named binary constructs such as victim-survivor, weak-strong, ill-healthy, and active-passive. She added to the list of binaries that of client-therapist, which she says contributes to discourses that some might experience as oppressive. This is particularly important to the enterprise of music therapy. Oliver and Barnes critique the dependent-independent duality. All human beings are dependent on other humans for survival. Therefore, the dependence of disabled people only varies by degree, and so the construct of dependence is not binary. Oliver and Barnes also questioned the ideological rhetoric that maintains that dependence is bad in the first place, noting that, quote, "the culture of dependency," end quote, has become a bugaboo for politicians to rail against. They pointed out that people with impairments are socialized into a negative self-outlook and therefore often see themselves as completely dependent on the charity of others for survival. This is, of course, unfortunate. The social model has its critics. Perhaps the most forceful among them is Tom Shakespeare, who acknowledged the simplicity of the social model, but maintained that its simplicity is also its fatal flaw. Shakespeare argued that the social model neglects impairment itself as an important aspect of disabled people's lives. The social model tautologically assumes the conclusion that disabled people are oppressed. The distinction between the medical perspective of impairment and the social perspective of disability is a crude one, and a barrier-free utopia is difficult to realize. Furthermore, Shakespeare's observation that the scholarship of Jenny Morris, for one example, emphasizes the degree to which representations of disabled people in the media foster prejudice even more so than physical barriers, the latter of which tend to be overemphasized by the social model of disability. It is a good reminder that attitudinal barriers are also barriers and must be taken into account by the calculus of the social model. In light of these critiques, in my view, the social model may be due for a slight upgrade. The upgrade I'd propose is to base disability theory on the successful model of neurodiversity, which in a very short time has become a formidable international movement. Thomas Armstrong, in Neurodiversity, Discovering the Extraordinary Gifts of Autism, ADHD, Dyslexia, and Other Brain Differences, suggests that rather than being glad to observe the natural diversity of human brains, instead, we pathologize the differences. One person has autism, another has a learning disability, still another suffers from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Armstrong challenges this by imagining if we did this with national differences. For example, people from Holland suffer from altitude deprivation syndrome, or racial differences. For example, Eduardo has a pigmentation disorder because his skin isn't white. Armstrong rightly points out that we'd be regarded as racists. Yet, objective science maintains these lines of thinking vis-a-vis the human brain all the time. The essential premise of neurodiversity is that neurological difference is a manifestation of human diversity and not a pathology per se. So, why can't we extrapolate this mode of thinking to all disability? This is the model I call able diversity. Does ableism in music therapy exist? Yes. Quote, music therapy has positioned itself squarely within the medical model of disability, end quote, observes Joseph Strauss, prominent music theorist and musicologist who has written extensively about music and disability. In the United States, we see this language deployed in the American Music Therapy Association's definition of music therapy. Quote, music therapy is the clinical and evidence-based of music interventions to accomplish individualized goals within a therapeutic relationship by a credentialed professional who has completed an approved music therapy program, end quote. The problem is that there is little consensus as to what constitutes evidence. Typically, the phrase, quote, evidence-based practice, end quote, is associated with the world of medicine. How medical model can one get? Evidence in the medical model worldview is hierarchical. The following model of evidentiary levels you see on your screen is quite typical. Notice that qualitative research, the type of research most readily associated with searches for meaning, is relegated to the 6th tier. What are the implications of this vis-a-vis ableism? For one thing, a systematic review of, say, 500 articles detailing the inherent defects of autism and commensurate treatments would constitute level 1 superior evidence, while a single article arguing for the inherent humanity of autistic people would constitute level 6 inferior evidence. Medical model articles that by their sheer numbers reinforce ableism are far more likely to be shunted upward to the 1st tier of evidence, while articles that deconstruct ableism itself are, de jure, 6th tier. The British Association for Music Therapy defines music therapy as such, quote, music therapy is an established psychological clinical intervention which is delivered by Health and Care Professionals Council, HCPC, registered music therapists to help people of all ages whose lives have been affected by injury, illness, or disability through supporting their psychological, emotional, cognitive, physical, communicative, and social needs, end quote. Notice that this is better in that it acknowledges the social needs of the client. This model is thus more amenable to importing social model of disability thinking, but it is still essentially medical model based with all the emphasis on defect that entails. What would able diverse music therapy look like? Volume 14, number 3 of Voices, a World Forum for Music Therapy, featured a number of scholars discussing the social model of disability in relation to music therapy. I proposed several practical takeaways from each article in order to better demonstrate able diverse music therapy in practice. Lacombe and Reed reminded us to be aware of hierarchies. The illusion that we, the practitioners, are able-bodied, whether we actually are or not, reinforces hierarchical dichotomies such as therapist-client, teacher-student, helper-helped, and importantly, able-bodied, disabled. They continue, quote, upon that privilege rests an array of power dynamics, quote, and it is important for even the beginning practitioner to be aware that she or he will wield a great deal of power in the therapist-client dynamic. Bassler told us that invisible disability, quote, poses a unique problem vis-a-vis disability in society, since invisible illness does not present itself outwardly and does not easily mark a person as having a disability, quote. My practical suggestion here, never assume the extent of one's disability by outward appearances alone. Rolfsjord pointed out that in a therapist-client binary, quote, the client is defined in terms of weakness, pathology, and passivity, while the therapist is described in terms of strengths, expertise, and activity, end quote. The suggestion here, do not participate in this paradigm. Respect your client for his or her inherent abilities and acknowledge your own limitations. Regarding music therapy for intellectually disabled young people, Rickson said, quote, young people would have the opportunity to set their own goals and to self-refer to a community music therapist who would organize and run music programs as needed, but would connect the young people with community musicians, teachers, and so forth, and work with those professionals to ensure that young people could access and transition to typical music services, end quote. The suggestion here, allow clients some authorship in their own goals. Strauss maintained that, quote, music therapy has positioned itself squarely within the medical model of disability, arguing that many sorts of human variability should be understood as illnesses, diseases, or other sorts of pathological medical conditions, and offering music as a source of normalization, remediation, and therapy toward a possible cure, end quote. My suggestion: don't participate in this paradigm either. Consider clients to be equals with you, not lesser beings who need to be cured of anything. This, for some, may strike as a radical proposition that flies in the face of much training, but it is necessary if we are to avoid condescending inequalities in our therapist-client relationships. Quote, if we were to privilege listening to what our autistic interlocutors had to say about what they think they need, quote, wrote Bacon, quote, and what matters to them over acting on the assumption that our main responsibility is to change them for the better in accordance with the conventions of a pathology-based model of wellness and functionality, think how radically altered the landscape of therapeutic interventions might become. So, listen to your client. Honish observed, quote, how exactly is it that music prevents some people from accomplishing a full normal selfhood? And how is it that music can be used in support of pervasive dichotomies, inclusive of ability and exclusive of disability, are some of the troublesome questions frequently absent from popular invocations of the power and transcendence of music, end quote. Furthermore, he added, quote, from further within disability studies, we find many reposts pushing back against years, decades, and centuries of well-intentioned work to normalize the lives of people with disabilities, end quote. A blunt suggestion is made here. Do not assume you are there to normalize your client. Celebrate your client for his or her diversity. Mattel, quote, would like to argue that music therapy as a field would benefit from collaboration with disability scholars and activists in general. This applies, for example, to the development of a curriculum of music therapy courses that should be informed by a disability studies perspective in contrast to a medical model of disability, end quote. This leads to my next suggestion. If your music therapy curriculum is not discussing the social model of disability, then educate yourself about it. These scholars provide extensive bibliographies and are a great place to start. Finally, Miyake, like other authors, recommended the deconstruction of the power dynamics and hierarchies implicit in the therapist-client relationship. Quote, in order to do this, the music therapist must put him or herself at a critical point beyond professional identity and tell his or her own experiences as an individual. This is different from a narrative of therapy. It demands that we take off our professional armor and reconsider the musical process resulting from the subjective reality of his or her own sensory experience. I would recommend then, do not become too invested in professional identity. Remember instead that equitable, egalitarian musicking with your client is the most important thing. Thank you.